Thank you so much, Ida. I'd like to start by thanking yourself and Diane for organising this great event and being so supportive and being very generous with allowing our students to come as well, because it makes a big difference. So thank you for that. I also want to start by thanking Peter Winstanley. Peter was my project supervisor in my undergraduate degree a couple of years ago. We were both in different places, different points, and I keep meeting Peter in unexpected places. I don't think I've ever thanked him properly for being such a wonderful supervisor. When I came back from COVID, there was a package, and it was 2 floppy disks with the code for my final year project, which I had thrown away years ago, but Peter had kept. He sent me, so thank you for that. What I want to talk today is what I've been doing for the last decade. It started kind of slowly and bubbled under and eventually coalesced into something about information behaviour during times of personal change. And as I said at the beginning, often we go through multiple changes at the same time with different changes. And what I want to look at is, I want to promote or present life transitions, significant life events, like parenting, bereavement, illness, redundancy, new jobs, and so on, as information behaviour activities, as information behaviour processes. And I'll present a new theory of information behaviour focused around the issues of personal change. So the stages we go through in times of personal change are information behaviours during those times, and what we require from information support services, either systems or people, to help us through those processes of personal change. And I'll show how our information requirements, particularly around things like discovery, around trust quality, and so on, and how we assess information change during this process of personal change, of transition. So just to start off, the reason I'm interested in life transitions is I think they're a very significant point for all of us. We all go through major transition points at different times in our life, but they're very interesting, I think, from an information perspective. And these events, they can be negative events, say like illness or redundancy or bereavement, that throw us. They throw off our sense of who we are and how we interact with the world and what meaning we have in the world. Or they can be very positive events, a new child, a new job, a PhD, events that happen to us that gives a new sense of inspiration or meaning to our lives. We change our lives in significant ways. But during these times, we are often thinking about very critical questions about our life. How will I cope? What is normal going to be? What will I be like once this happened? How will I deal with this new situation? Where will I end up? And we need a lot of information to answer these questions. They don't happen very quickly. It might kind of ongoing processes of interacting with information to help answer these questions. But these times in our lives are actually some of the most significant, most challenging to deal with from an information perspective. So we think of things like your parenting, or bereavement, or redundancy, and so on. We're often suddenly thrown into a situation where we don't know what information we need to know. We don't know who to ask. We don't know how to form questions, where information is. We might lack knowledge of ways to ask information. This is a quote that I like very much from Johnson in 1997 in his book on cancer-related information seeking. And he's talking about people who are presented with a cancer diagnosis. He said, individuals confronted with cancer often find they must make judgments with an inadequate knowledge base for even understanding basic terminology. So without even basic knowledge of the area in which they're working, they have to make significant decisions about their own lives. We might lack anybody even in our social circles who can help us with information in this phase. Sometimes we can. Sometimes we're socially prepared for certain life changes like relationships or parenting or so on. But other times we might not know anybody who's undergone a similar change. And so we're immediately forced into interacting with strangers and then trying to work out who to trust and who not to trust. And I'll come back to this later. In some of these significant life events, we also may be physically tired, we might be traumatized, we might be cognitively, emotionally frozen, and not have the resources to use the same information skills we would use to solve problems in other areas of our life. So suddenly we have to develop new ways of interacting with information, new behaviours, new practices in a time where we're most vulnerable and least able to do that. So I think transitions is a very interesting area from an information perspective. Different types of transition different types of significant life event can affect our information behaviour. So if the event is somehow stigmatized by the society around us, it's often harder to get information. We have to, people who are facing a stigmatized life event, maybe often finding it more difficult to get information, less information is offered. They have to use anonymous forms of getting information. Whereas unstigmatized events, people give you information, lots of information provided, it's easy to get information, ask for it. So I think there are the difference between a pregnancy, somebody in their 20s becoming pregnant, obviously is a nice event, people are happy. If you're a 12-year-old girl, it's very different. And those kind of experiences can make it difficult to get information or not. I won't go through all of these, but if something's a change is planned, like a retirement, you can work towards it, you can gather information, you can take your time speaking to lots of people. If it's sudden, like a redundancy, you suddenly have to get information and deal with it. So the effect is very different. If the change is something that happens to us, like a redundancy, a bereavement or something, it's much more different than if it's a change we bring about, we want to engage in. Again, information behaviours are different. Sometimes it's easier to get information, sometimes it's harder. Sometimes the way that we get information is very different. I'll come back to this later. This is very important. Positive and negative changes. As I'll show you in a minute, often the trajectory is the same, but the experience is very different. This paper is a brilliant paper. If you haven't read it, bad is stronger than good. I urge you to read it. It's a survey of different areas of social science. And what Baumaster and colleagues are arguing is that most of us in our research look at negative events over positive events. And they argue it's an evolutionary drive that if something bad happens to us, we have to spend a lot of time, it's a threat, it might kill us. So we spend a lot of cognitive time thinking about why it happened, how could it have been avoided by the effects. We spend a lot of our emotion thinking about negative events. And they just require more significant changes to the way we think about the world. So most of you probably couldn't remember what you had to eat for last Tuesday. You remember that for a long time afterwards, and you think about why it happened, how you could avoid it. So what they argue then is, as humans, we think more about negative events, and that affects how we do research. We research more negative events than positive ones. And even when it's a nice event, like having a child, we have to make it a problem in order to investigate it. So rather than saying enhancing something nice, it has to be a problem that we have to tackle. So lots of people have studied negative events over positive events. This was also important if we have to go somewhere else. If an event requires us to move somewhere else, it's much more important and harder. So if it goes to prison, to move to a retirement home, to go to hospital, we have to move to places where we don't understand how the information works. And therefore, it's much more challenging. We don't know who to trust, where information is, how to access it. So from an information behaviour perspective, there's lots of different types of transitions that can affect our information behaviour in different ways. And lots of people have proposed different theories of transitions. People from psychology, sociology, education, religion, law, business are interested in kind of career transitions. And typically what they are kind of phase models that show there are different stages in a transition, change, where we're feeling different things, we're thinking different things, and we're doing qualitatively different things. They're nearly all qualitative models. And what they argue is we go through different stages in a transition event, and we're doing different things. Not everybody will go through every stage. Sometimes people get stuck, sometimes people exit. But where we get stuck is often where information professionals, in the form of librarians or nurses or counsellors or health visitors, help us through the transition event by presenting us information or by helping us work through information ourselves. Here's an example of a transition model. This is one I like. This is one from Di Williams in psychology, particularly looking at career transitions. What I like about this one is it says that positive and negative events can have the same trajectory. So positive events do require adjustment, psychological adjustment and behavioral adjustment. And what he was saying was that something happens and we have either numbness from a negative event or excitement to a positive event. And then there's this provisional period where we try and minimize change, but often then there's a kind of crisis, a drop in our confidence, because things are not the same anymore. Things are different, and we have to absorb this event into the way that we think about the world. A lot of this is about gaining information, using information, and hopefully we end up in a better place than we were before, or we might not. We might just end up in a kind of partial adjustment. But that's where we end up. We keep going in this partial, never quite getting back to normal. But there's lots of these different models. But what I noticed is that in looking at them, a lot of them are very light on information behaviour. What we do with information. They all say information is important, but they don't say what people do with information, how they get it, where they get it, and how they assess it. So what I was doing in the work I've been doing recently is taking these models. I'm not going to go through all this. Taking a lot of these models from different areas, from sociology, psychology, law, religion, education, business, and putting them together into a kind of framework for thinking about information behaviour during times of personal change. And I was using this process called meta-ethnography, which takes qualitative theories and puts them together in a kind of single framework. I'll show you the result in a minute. But even after doing this, there's very little about information behaviour in this. So to try and create an information behaviour theory rather than just another theory from other disciplines that we use, what I did was undertake a kind of big literature review, looking at different transition points in human lifespan. So looking at creating relationships, ending relationships, becoming a parent, not becoming a parent, finding work, ending work, developing sexualities, sickness, health, recovery, being a victim of crime, going to prison, bereavement and dying. And looking at all these different areas for information science and outside information science, and trying to extract the information behaviours and fit them into a process model of personal change. I read about the 1,500 different papers, so it took quite a bit of time. It was one of those things that just exploded in my face. I thought this won't take that long. And then you realise how many people have written about these kind of things. I know I've never been in a library, but so a lot of people have done a lot of research. What I ended up with was this. I'm going to do my usual joke about you don't have to memorise this. It's no exam at the end of it. But what I'm going to do is this is where it ended up. And the rest of the talk, I'm going to break it down and talk about the information behaviours at different stages, and what we're doing with information, and how our information buyers can support what is a process of change from before a transition to the end of a transition. It starts with some kind of event where we go through 3 main stages, what I call understanding, negotiating, and resolving, and 3 process points, engaging and acting and establishing, that move from one stage to another. And what I'm arguing is this is an information behaviour process. So all the changes that go through parenting and creating relationships and gaining work and ending work and becoming things, becoming ill and so on, they're information behaviour processes. They're ways that information changes us in response to something happening to us. And all these things here are information behaviour activities, for which we need information, we need to gain information, decide how to assess information, where to get it, and what information is useful for going from here to there, from before to after change. So this is where it starts. So what I'm characterizing is kind of life before. So transitions, as Anne said, a lot of different transitions might happen at the same time. But generally, when we think about transitions, I'll come back to it later, we think of a starting point, which is a kind of life before something happened. And here, transitions happen against this normal life. It's a way of living that has some kind of coherence, some kind of regularity. We have normal tasks, we have normal ways of interacting with the world. We have some kind of sense of coherence about the way we're living our lives. Ryo Savalainen, in his theory of everyday life information seeking, characterized this as mastery of life. A way of living that makes sense to us, even not to other people, and over which we have some sense of control. We've arranged our information activities into some way that makes sense for us, and we can explain to other people. So how we gain access to health information, to legal information, to news, who we interact with, how we interact with them, where we get information. So we have regularities to our information needs, our information sources, and the ways that we tackle problems using information. And this can be expressed like this. I'm expressing as, we have regular information sources, we have regular information behaviors and practices, ways we interact with information. We have people around us that can act as mediators towards information. We have established beliefs and roles. So beliefs about how the way the world works and our roles within it, whether we're a student or teacher or librarian or father or daughter, ways that we socially interact with other people and that affects our information. And we gather information all the time. So we're constantly thinking about the world and how it might be. Then, something happens. Something happens that forces us to think about the world and how we're existing within the world. It's not always events. Every event doesn't cause a transition. Sometimes we just ignore them, sometimes they're too small, sometimes they're put aside because they're dealing with something bigger. And a lot of people did that with health concerns during COVID. They ignored them because they're trying to cope with COVID and the effects of that. What I characterize in my reading, what makes difference just an event, something happens to us in a transition, is dissonance. So the bigger the dissonance between the way that we're living our life and what's just happened to us, forces us into this process of transition. And dissonance can be from different things. It can be threats. Does the things happen to us threaten us in some way? Does it force a threat to our identity and the way that we think about ourselves and the way that we think about the world? Are we acting against cultural norms? Does this event act against our expectations of how the world works? That's really important. Something really unfair happens to us, it forces a lot of attention to, because we have to reestablish how we think the world works. Does something require us to move somewhere else? Migration, going to prison, going to a retirement community, going to hospital. It's the first time this has happened to us. So first child, first job, first bereavement, they're often much more psychologically significant because they challenge how we think about the world. And typically we like to assign causes and effects. We like to assign change to an event, even if that's not really how it happened. But the nature of the event can be really critical. What information needs occur, how we think about the event, and things like stigma, social capital, and so on are really important into this initial stage of thinking about the event. We might exit a transition at this point, not important enough, or we can't deal with it. It's too big to deal with, and we have to ignore it. We go into denial. And denial is an information behavior. Not being able to deal with something and ignoring it. But in this theory of information behaviors, the first stage in dealing with a transition event is trying to understand it. What has happened and what's the significance to us? And this is about a process of orientating ourselves to change. When I say dealing with the change, we're trying to understand what it means and how much will we have to change our lives. It is a process of disorientation. This is when we're most vulnerable. We're uncertain, we're unsure, and we might be tired, we might be emotionally upset, we might be psychologically traumatized. Therefore, it's a very important point. And what we're doing here is trying to understand the event. Before I knock over. So we're trying to determine cause, estimate threats, predicting outcomes. What has happened, what will happen. And a lot of what we're doing here, information seeking, is seeking comparisons, seeking other people that have experienced the same event and using their experiences to judge what might happen to us. And the ones that are closest to us in a social sense, are the ones that are most significant in thinking about what might happen to us. Even if 100 strangers have had this outcome, if we know one person has had this outcome, that's one we trust. Even though it's a bias, it's the wrong way to think about it, but that's how we do it. We try and minimize things. If we make the event more familiar, then it's more likely we're going to control it and be able to deal with it. So our information seeking here is biased as well. We want outcomes that are favorable to us. Big topic is normality, judging normality. What's normal now? What will normal be in the future? Is it normal to feel like this in this situation? And imagining what will happen. At a time of big uncertainty, and what happens during times of uncertainty is imagination fills this gap. We start imagining what might happen. How will we deal with this if it does happen this way? And a lot of people argue that worry and anxiety is kind of preparatory coping. You're ruminating through things so that you're prepared if that outcome does happen or that outcome does. At this stage for information science, at this stage, people know less about their new situation. So they have the least knowledge of the situation, what information is available, where to get the information, what they should be asking, what to search, where to search for, what information they might lack. They can start to think of some information needs, but they don't know what they should be asking about this situation. Social barriers, including stigma, can make it harder to get information. I said before, if a change or an event is stigmatized in some way, then people are much more likely to go for anonymous forms of information seeking. Online news groups, for example, or discussion things on Reddit, ways they can hide their identity without having to be visible and asking for information. What's generally helpful here are solutions that help people identify sources of help. Because often at the start of a transition, what you want is somebody that can work through it with you to help you understand what you know, what you need to know, how to behave. Narrative forms, stories of other people's experience and their outcomes are very important. That's why seeking social comparisons is very critical. It might come from other people, it might come from blogs or autobiographies or narrative forms, which are very good. People want to be able to learn vocabularies, learn the words that they can use to find their own information. I'm sure everybody's in that situation, especially this, not just big life events, but things to do with literature. If you think you know the vocabulary, and then halfway through you learn another word that just reveals all this other source of information. But this is really critical, especially if you're interacting in areas with very complex vocabularies and very complex forms of information. What people often want are ways to synthesize information. Information overload is very common at the start of almost every transition. Partly because there's so much information, but also some of it's inconsistent, some of it's the same, it's slightly different, so you have to unpick it, and you're not at least able to deal with information. But at the same time, you can feel that you lack information, because you lack information that's personalized to you. You've got all this stuff, but what you want is the bits about you. But that's hard to work through. And what people often want is information to help them understand the problem, not necessarily to solve the problem. That's too late. They want to understand the situation before they can work out how to deal with it. There's lots of information around here. There's lots of user-generated content that's used a lot. Social media, blogs, forums, and so on. And some of these can be kind of repackaged into support mechanisms, but then there's a challenge of how do you work out which information is good for understanding a problem rather than solving it. And actually, I don't know a lot of work analysing people on forums and so on. The people at the earlier stages of understanding a problem often get the least support. If they write longer narrative forms asking, they're less able to ask a precise question. Therefore, it's harder for other people to answer what it is to give them information. But so again, people who are most vulnerable get less information, and people who are further along in their journey can answer more precise questions, ask more precise questions. But generally, then people move into Facebook, they engage with the process of change. They understand kind of an idea of where they want to be, and then they're trying to move on to resolving this, to moving forward and tackling the life transition. Sometimes can make it easier, harder. Supportive information environments. Is there information available? Is it easy to get? Do they know where to get it? Sometimes information is hidden. You might actually be working against a hostile information environment, makes it much harder. You need people to help you with these. Does the organization, for example, in work context, allow people to fail? Or does it penalize not knowing how to do things? There's interesting studies from business contexts about question answering when you start a new job. Asking too many questions is seen as a bad thing, but not asking enough is also a bad thing. So the sweet spot of asking enough questions, but you don't know in your organization there is enough. So there's lots of these things. I won't have time to go through them. But sometimes it's easier for information environments to move forward. But this is harder. You're working against the information environments. The next stage is negotiating. And I call this, so this is kind of creating a response to the change, how you're going to tackle the change. And I call this negotiating because often it is a process of trial and error, piecing together, groping towards a solution. It's very iterative, it's very experimental. Morton Hertzum recently published a paper on experimentation within information behaviour. And what he argued was experimentation is very common in kind of more process-given changes, because experimentation allows you to create information from within a situation to help you progress within the situation. So it's more trial and error. But what we're doing here is trying to balance the need to change against the desire to keep things the same, because we want to keep things the same. We want to keep them familiar, controllable, manageable, understandable, but we recognize we have to change as well. So there's this balancing act. Even when we want change, we're trying to make it work within a certain set of parameters. And information seeking is, I'd say, often, usually biased towards the kind of outcome we want. So it's not just about the best information, best outcome, it's the best outcome for us by retaining all these checks and balances of what we want. So we're trying to balance a lot of things. And what we're doing things here is about reconstructing and changing social networks to get the people lined up that are going to support us. We are doing a lot of really information work, decision making, predicting consequences, strategizing, not just planning, but actually working out how to do things, triangulating information from different sources to make decisions. Previously, we're just acknowledging uncertainty. Here, we're trying to work through to make decisions. We're also doing things like feedback seeking. A lot of people at this stage will enact a change. New parents, they'll often publicly show they know how to hold the baby, how to feed the baby. In work environments, after a certain stage, people will publicly show they know how to do tasks to show that they're competent. But in doing that, they're getting feedback. So these are called competence displays, but they're getting feedback. So they're a way to gain information by exposing yourself and how to do things. You'll get feedback on that. And a lot of learning about new information behaviours, developing your skills. And this can be, again, information science implications. At this stage, people have starting to develop bodies of knowledge about where they're going and possibilities for change. And they're doing a lot of really serious, detailed information work. What is required here, what is very helpful, is information provision that helps people make comparisons and make decisions. So structuring of information, not just giving information, showing, you maybe you're roughly coursing out a solution, then you want fine-grained decisions. What choices are available and what might be the outcomes of particular choices? People are doing a lot of what ifs here. What if I do this? What will they do? What if I do this? What if I take this mortgage? What if I do that one? What if I move to this job? What will that be the implications on where I live and where my kids go to school? If I take that job, what will be that? So doing a lot of predicting from their actions. So they want support to evaluate options. And this is where the kind of classic things of credibility, accuracy, recency all come into play. This is the fuel for people to make these decisions. But information intermediaries, systems and people are really important here. Do they help people make these decisions? Is information presented in the way that people can make these decisions easily and map out the consequences? Cognitive authorities, of course, the board, the social effective authorities, Diane and Pamela McKenzie, wrote how the information is presented is also very important. So it's not just, is the information good, but is it presented in such a way that people find accessible? Is it engaging? Is it something that people trust? And trust is often not based on the content, but how the information is presented. So again, I've done a lot of work on news groups and forums, and experiential information is so important. So you'll see people say, I've got this problem. They'll say, but if, please try and help. But if you've not been in the situation yourself, please don't reply. So they only want information from people who've been in the same situation, regardless of how good the other information is that they get. Now, Frida Chapman talked about this as information impoverishment. So if you only accept information from people like you, we've had the same experience of you, you're cutting off a lot of useful sources of information and not able to make the best available, best use of the information available. But people do it because they see it as a signal of trust. Negotiating then leads to enacting, and most transitions you have to perform the transitions, you have to make some change to make the transition happen. This can be harder if you're getting negative social feedback, you're working against social norms of stigma. It can be easier if there's positive social feedback, no stigma. You're working with social norms of how to behave, and you're willing to take risks, and you have the capacity to act. So you might not fully have control over how you respond to change. You're working within social environment. Other people are very important throughout this. Either just from an initial source of information or to becoming guides in how to live our life within a new community. And often there's two types of people. There's professionals who are kind of paid to help us through a transition. So people like nurses, counsellors, health workers, and so on, lawyers, teachers, academics, librarians. There's also people from the volunteer community. And this led to different literatures. So if we think about professionals, lots of people who have the job to provide information in different ways to help us through transition. Nursing literature is very rich in studies of how nurses should help people through transitions. There's a theory of transitions theory from Elaf Millet, one of the pioneers in theorizing about nursing. And she talked about the idea of roles. So people have roles, might be cancer patient, somebody going to a retirement home, new mother. And the job of nurses is to help people take on these new roles. And sometimes we can take them on successfully, sometimes not successfully. And she just you talked about the role insufficiency. Sometimes people struggle with the transition. They struggle to take on this new role. And therefore, the job of the nurse is to help people take on this new role by using what she called role supplementation, where the nurse provides information, again, or experience to bring the role incumbent, so the cancer patient or the person going to a retirement home, to full awareness of the behaviours, sentiments, sensations, and goal involved in the transition. So giving information, but also experience about how you will feel, how you will behave, what will happen to you in this transition, to make it easier for somebody to walk into that transition and successfully make a transition. And other disciplines talk about it in this way as well. But in a lot of areas, we don't have somebody paid to help us. And the support comes from other people within local communities. They might be charities, they might be social groups, they might be community groups. And often these groups have people within them who act as the person to welcome in new people. And sometimes they're trained in that role. And these people are really important because if we join a new community, often our critical information literacy drop. We overtrust other people, particularly if the community we're joining is somehow stigmatized, but aspirational to us. So other people might see as stigmatized, but we see as a group of people like us and really want to belong. So anybody that helps us get into that group, we overtrust because we don't want to be critical and risk losing that bridge into this new group. So we overtrust these people. And then once we know the group, we can build up more critical information literacy. But we don't know whether these people are to be trusted or not. Sometimes they are very nice, welcoming people who want to welcome us in. Sometimes they are people who are using our naivety, our information and experience to take advantage of us. And this often happens in things like prisons, where people are kind of groomed by being presented with false information with social norms. But you don't know who you've got until it's too late. When we've got, this is an example just of transitions from one of my PhD students, Bakola Onditan, and she was working with asylum seekers and refugees in Glasgow, looking at their integration journey from coming to Glasgow and then eventually, for some of them, becoming accepted asylum seekers and getting full rights to engage in the whole society. The details of this are important, but what she uncovered was that people go through journeys, and what their information needs reflect where they are in this integration journey. So everybody asks about housing first. It's the first thing they need to know, solve. Then it's support, legal issues. If they get to the stage of being successful asylum seekers, then they're asking about employment and benefit and education. And then what she did was map on where do people get information to answer these needs. And what she saw was all the way through people are important, but at the start, where people are getting information is information professionals, Scottish Refugee Council, British Refugee Council, and informal places where they're picking up information from other people. And what they want here is very personalised information, other people to work with them through the challenges they're facing. Here, they're kind of informationally integrated. Here, they're now successful in their asylum claims, they're interacting with information same as everybody else. So all the information they're getting here is the same information that's given to the host society, and now they're able to use it. So their information journey goes from needing a lot of very personalised help to needing no help with their information. People are being used all the way through, but in different ways and different points. Finally, we get to the stage of resolving a transition event. And there's two things here. There's a process of commitment to change, meaning making, creating narratives. And often when we're going through a significant event, we retell it to ourselves. We reshape what happened to us into a narrative that we can tell other people and we can tell ourselves. And there's lots of studies that show that this is not what actually happened, but what we want to understand has happened. The process of psychological discovery, where we create a new sense of value and purpose in our life. And a lot of what we're doing here is using social comparisons again, looking at what other people did and how they went through the same transition event. Did we end up better or worse? Were we different to them? Is there something unique and different about what we did compared to them? What we're also doing is refining our new behaviours and practices and new ways of interacting with information and interacting with other people, and developing new interpretive abilities about the situation around us. So again, if it's parenting, you might be interpreting our child. If it's a new job, it's interpreting the people around us. Who's who? How do they work? How do I read Emma versus how do I read Manisha? Who do I go to for help? If it's about health, then we're developing new interpretation and interpretive abilities about our bodies and how they work and how to read our bodies and what they're telling us. And at this stage, a lot of the information work is not about information seeking or gaining new information. It's about committing to the information we've already got. And there's a lot of psychological studies show at this stage, we reject information that was against this understanding we've built up. We accept information that fits this account that we have of our own transition. So we only want, again, we're biased towards certain types of information. For significant changes, we might have new sources of information to observe. We need new information behaviours. For example, if we get a diagnosis of diabetes, then we have to start collecting our blood sugars, we have to start interacting with new health professionals and have new health appointments and so on. We might have to create new information stores to record new information about ourselves or about our life or about our family. We probably want tailored information. So at this stage, we don't want information. Again, we only want information about us, and we're better able to understand it because we've developed a body of knowledge about our life in relation to this new event. We might become sources of advice to other people. So we might be the people on the news groups and Reddit and writing blogs about our event and how we handled it and giving advice to other people. We might be the people with experiential information that people seek out to use as social comparisons for their event that just happened to them. Sorry, what is the time?
6 minutes too.
Oh, I stopped wearing a watch during COVID. Well, I noticed I looked the weekend and they all had no batteries in those. So resolving then leads to a process of maintenance. Does the transition, is it going to continue to be part of your life? And if so, how? Life after, I don't believe I've got literacy is ironic. It's a new information world. Maybe a bigger change, maybe a smaller change, maybe just part of your world, maybe bigger, maybe the whole world, big part. But different ways of doing things, different ways of accessing information, different beliefs about how the world works, different roles, different sources, different behaviours, different ways of seeing information, knowing where information is. So this is a process, and typically information science evaluating processes is quite hard because people dip in and out, and this isn't just one episode where people get information. They're picking up information from different places and different people and putting it all together in a patchwork. So it can be quite difficult to extract how different sources and services can help people. But I think we can think about process-based evaluations again, and how did people get information? What information was critical in helping them move forward in a process, and was it successful? Again, back to Rouse Adelaide, he defined mastery of life as the elimination of dissonance between perceptions of how things are now and how things should be. And that's what a lot of people are doing with their transitions. They're aware they're in this kind of this liminal space where things are happening. Things are evolving, things are emerging. I'm not quite sure where they're going to be, but you often have a sense of what kind of outcome feels right, even if they can't express it or articulate it. And maybe how do people identify sources, how do they develop an understanding of life, how to get there through information, and what information helps and what information doesn't is one thing we can do. And I think colleagues in areas like counselling and nursing might have interesting ideas of how they evaluate the services that we could adapt to information work. But I think often what's key is the information has to resonate with the person. It's not just useful or interesting or valid. It's got to speak to them and how they're trying to adapt to their life and what's important to them. And this need for transformational change. So I think certain types of information are more useful than others. So what I presented here is a three-stage description of transitions. I call it understanding, negotiating, resolving. Because these clearly dissonance, experimentation, and reconstructing narratives and understandings. The same thing. Each phase is important, but people, and they're kind of overlapping, they're not completely distinct. I presented this way as a kind of idealized abstract. People move backwards and forwards a bit, people can exit. But each phase is important, has its own aims, its own qualitative behaviours, and information behaviours and requirements for information systems and services. The information is appropriate for one stage might be a distraction. So it's that whole thing about giving, it's the right information at the right time. The right information at the wrong time can be worse than useless. I think the language in which people ask for information, talk about themselves, are often be useful guides into what people are trying to do. It's not just the content, but the way they're talking can often help you understand what it is they're trying to do, which stage they're at, and what help is best for them. And structuring information support is critical, not just giving information, but understanding the processes through change. And maybe offering and helping people realize information is here, even if you don't yet need it. Be aware that it's here when you do need it is very important. But transitions, I think, is a really rich area of human life. Lots of people from different disciplines, as well as information science is interested in, and information is critical in all transitions. But the same information skills, as I said in the beginning, that we use in normal everyday life, normal work, are not always available to us during transitions. So we need to develop new ones and think about how to support those, because people are often operating in very different ways and thinking differently about the world. But good design of information services, of course, really important to help people through these really critical times in their life. I've rushed through this a bit. If you're interested, there's more of a theory in this open access paper, and a lot more detail than this, which is not open access. So go for that one first, if you're at all interested. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you again very much for the invitation.